So today I'm talking about tiling diagrams for Origami Tessellations, and just a little bit of background before I start is that each of these folders here, where I've stored my various origami tessellation designs, is showing a tiling. It's showing a way of arranging shapes that can generate many different origami tessellations. And for a subset of these patterns, I've developed more more advanced representations than just showing the shapes themselves that I call tiling diagrams. And that's really the focus of this live stream, this video. I do have my eyes on the chat as well, so we can talk back and forth. Feel free to ask me questions at any time during this stream. And I'll start by going through the square tiling. So this might look like a checkered board pattern, it might look like a grid, but each individual colored square here represents one twist, particularly one square twist that has one kind of pleat. So it only has single depth plates or double depth plates. It doesn't have a mix of single depth and double depth plates. And the depth of the pleat is the distance in grid spacings between the mountain and the valley fold of the plate. So when we have this structure, well, another thing about the tiles are telling us where the pleats are going. So a pleat goes between two adjacent tiles, and specifically pleats cross tile boundaries perpendicularly. And this is more a my definition thing. If you read Robert Lang's book, he'll say there's some angle that defines how pleats cross tile boundaries, but I don't think that we need to match the tiling to the physical geometry of the crease pattern or the folded tessellation. And so we can just say all pleats cross tile boundaries perpendicularly. End of story. The tiling is an abstraction of the crease pattern, but it doesn't necessarily lay on top of the crease pattern and tell us exactly what's going on. So for these connections, I have a skeleton layer. This is the same skeleton layer that I have in all of my crease patterns. So if we, for example, go into one of these patterns, I'll just go to one of the ones that is fairly salient. Anytime I have a PDF crease pattern, I have some information about it, photos of the front and back, and then the crease pattern itself, and then the skeleton on the crease pattern. So the skeleton is the tie between the crease pattern and the tiling. And it's specifically the connectivity of the skeleton, not the particular arrangement, like the orientation of each of the lines. It's more about, in this particular case, with this crease pattern, this hexagon is connected to 3 triangles and to 3 hexagons. Each of the triangles is connected to 2 other triangles and a hexagon. And you can apply that. It's the same characteristics for every hexagon and every triangle, and that's what generates this structure. So when we're looking at the square tiling, that structure is each square has 4 square neighbors. Period, end of story. That's what defines the structure. And we can look at some other possibilities for this tiling by saying, okay, what are my symmetry options? And here in the tiling diagram, I have a bunch of different symmetry options. Like on the square tiling, I have more symmetry options than pretty much anything else. but we can have full symmetry. This would be your closed square weave, your open square weave. This is positions of 4-fold and 2-fold rotational symmetry, and these blue lines are mirror symmetry lines. So I know that if a crease pattern is going to comply with this symmetry in the tiling, then I'm only using one twist, right-handed form and left-handed form of one twist on one side of the paper. If I then say, okay, I don't want the full symmetry, I just want the alternating symmetry, that gets rid of the mirror symmetry lines, and now I can pick any one square for the red tile, any other square for the white tile. These could be on opposite sides of the paper, one could be open, the other could be closed. They can't be hybrid twists with this particular symmetry because we still need the 4-fold rotational symmetry in the square block. But we don't necessarily have to stick with the symmetry. We can do hybrid twists in alternating patterns in the square tiling. They're just going to be positions of 2-fold rotational symmetry, not 4-fold. We can go on and say, okay, what if, say we have some wacky hybrid twist and we just want to mirror that one twist? I think it would be a little bit more symmetric than that, but if you're thinking about the squashed form, which is asymmetric, then this would be your maximum symmetry with something like fence weave, which incidentally is a pattern that has a tutorial in Tessellation Academy, and these tiling diagrams are something that I explain, like a new one or several every month in Tessellation Academy. You can also mirror groups of 2 twists or groups of 4 twists, and there could be some rotational symmetry in the middle. This is just getting that way of thinking about the different options. So you can then say, okay, I have 4 different slots to fill, and then I am going to mirror everywhere. And that's a different way of thinking than saying, I have 2 slots to fill and then mirror, or I'm going to pick 2 twists and alternate them. And all of those, the alternation and the boxes with mirror symmetry, is covered by this decision tree. Sometimes I call these design trees also, because it's taking a look and saying, okay, I want to make some choices, and I'm going to end up with origami tessellation designs. And I'm making these choices at the tiling level because that is going to, it's going to abstract away a lot of the complication that can get in the way of figuring out the pattern as a whole. So when I'm making these choices, I am then grabbing a twist in my digital toolbox and putting it on a digital grid and saying, okay, that goes there, this connects to it, and then I can do mirror symmetry on that, I can play with the spacing, I can do all of these different operations without messing with a grid. And so as these decisions are happening, the first decision is, okay, let's say I'm doing an alternating pattern. My twist A is going to either be closed, open, or hybrid. And this little dashed line says that's not actually all the options. You can have more different twists that you use. You could have double open, you could have a different hybrid, you could do any number of things. But for simplicity, closed, open, or hybrid for twist A in the alternation. And then for twist B in the alternation, you can have closed, open, or hybrid on the same side as the initial twist, or closed, open, or hybrid on the opposite side. And for this open branch, I eliminated the closed option because closed and then open is the same as open and then closed. So I just left the closed and then open here, eliminated the open and then closed options. But we still have the option of open, then open on the same or opposite side, or hybrid on the same or opposite side. And you'll notice when we have this hybrid, we already had a bunch of hybrid options off of the closed and open branches. So I eliminated the closed and open options because those would be identical, up to mirror symmetry, because generally my first twist I choose is going to be right-handed and then the second is going to be left-handed. But I consider mirror copies of the same pattern to be the exact same pattern. So anyways, with the hybrid twists, that's where you start getting into, okay, I have an orientation choice here too. My second hybrid twist could be in the same orientation as the first, or could be the opposite orientation. If it's the same orientation, on the same side of the paper, I get fence weave. If it's the opposite, I get herringbone weave. Two very different patterns. And then if it's the same orientation on the opposite side of the paper, I haven't actually folded that yet. So that's a candidate for going in and saying, well, this should work this way, or this is a new pattern that has never been folded before. Let me go and fold it. Or I can say, okay, I want to have a hybrid twist on one side and then a hybrid twist in the opposite orientation on the other side. And that gets you to hybrid lattice, which has also been taught inside of Tessellation Academy. And then it goes down further and says, well, what if you're not just alternating two twists? What if you're applying those mirror symmetries around groups of twists? Then you're still choosing 2 in the case of open-closed stripes, or 4 twists in the case of ABBA clusters or open windows. Actually, no, open windows is just 2. But ABBA clusters and meandering squares, which is a different spacing of ABBA clusters, is clusters of 4. And you can do that with mirror symmetry. You can do that with extra spacing, like promenade. There's a whole bunch of different options that I've mostly left undocumented because the different options of like, okay, are you just using those 2? Are you using 4? Are you mirroring? Are you spacing? That would fill up more space than I had in this document with these blank question marks, because that just has not been explored yet. So there's the dotted lines again to remind us that none of these options are the final word. There's always more that can be explored here. Then coming back to the square tiling diagram, we can look at some other symmetries too. So got this extension 1, where these positions of fourfold rotational symmetry now are not next to each other, like they were in the alternating with mirror symmetry or the alternating without mirror symmetry options. They're put a little further apart from each other. And then extension 2 puts them a little further apart. Extension 3 puts them even further apart. So extension 1, so relative to this blue dot 4, extension 1 had the gold dot over here, extension 2 had it up here, and now extension 3 has it over here. And all of these are different ways of thinking about how many positions you have. So with extension 1, you can see there is a blue square, a white square, and a gold square. 3 positions. In extension 2, there's a blue square, white square, gold square, gray square. 4 positions. Extension 3 has blue, white, gold, and gray, so still 4 positions, but they're arranged differently so that the position of twofold rotational symmetry is not in a square. That actually makes this easier to design in. And it leaves some asymmetric positions to be exploited with whatever twist you want. Hybrid, open, close, back, front, doesn't matter. But we have these flexible options of how to repeat any particular motif that we're interested in. So coming back to another decision tree, here I'm looking specifically at the second symmetry extension, which I used to call accommodate to before I really nailed down like how am I generating these symmetry extensions. Now I call it expansion 1, expansion 2, expansion 3, etc. And so here we have a choice of central square, which has to be fourfold rotationally symmetric. So it's going to be closed or open. Technically, we do have an option for double open, triple open, etc. And then the next twist can be open, closed, hybrid in one orientation, hybrid in the other orientation, all of those options on the opposite side of the paper for each of the branches. And then the third twist has all of those same options again. So we had 2 choices for the first twist, 8 choices for the second twist, 8 choices for the third twist. So 2 times 8 times 8. So 16 times 8 is going to be 128. And that gives us so many different patterns, most of which have not been explored. Like the vast majority of which have not been explored. But these 3 choices together combine geometrically. So we've got choice 1, choice 2, where the pleats come together from 2 choice 2s that are rotated around choice 1. We put choice 3. And then we have this right angle equal distance relationship because of the symmetry points. So if we go back to symmetry extension 2 in the tiling diagram, what this is saying is that from a position of fourfold rotational symmetry to a position of twofold rotational symmetry to the different position of fourfold rotational symmetry, because the same position is just on the opposite side, this forms a 45-45-90 right triangle all the time, always, whenever you have these positions of symmetry. So we don't actually have a free choice for the fourth twist, the gray tile. We have to match this triangle so that, and I just left off the diagonal of the triangle, we have to match the triangle. And notice here the center of the hybrid twist is not on a grid intersection, which is kind of interesting. And that is going to define our fourth twist. So then coming up here, I took this one branch out of the 128 different options. I'm showing 8 of them. And I say, okay, what are the possible outcomes along this branch? And I see, okay, we could have a double open square for our first one. We could be in an alternating pattern. So here the choices were closed square on the front, open square on the back, then closed square on the front again, and then we're stuck in the alternation in this symmetry. Not necessarily stuck if you do other things. And there's a couple that get you to cursed square twists, which I try to avoid. And really that's another option we could have had the whole way. Even in this central square, I could have chosen a cursed square. It is fourfold rotationally symmetric. I just am coming up with a lot of this theory behind these tessellation designs in order to avoid the cursed squares. So I could have had cursed squares in the second option. I could have had them in the third option. And we would have gotten to like 3 times 9 times 9, which would be 81 times 3 is 243 different options instead of 128. But yeah, I don't want to fold the cursed squares. And so we're narrowing down that 128 by the ones that give cursed squares I'm not going to fold. You can, but I'm not going to. And then we can find out by drawing our crease patterns and drawing these triangles, by drawing this amount, drawing around, and technically we wouldn't have to use the triangle. We could use the fact that this is a position of twofold rotational symmetry, stick another of the S1, the second choice squares up above, and say, okay, this distance between pleats is tube pleat spacing. So this distance between pleats needs to be tube pleat spacing because this needs to be a position of fourfold rotational symmetry and therefore needs to be this size. So you can do it if you're just working on a grid by folding instead of looking at crease patterns. But this is the structure, and this is how I know I'm never going to run out of origami tessellation designs, because there's no end to the number of symmetry extensions. There's no end. Like I could go through and work on this for a solid year. This is one symmetry extension in one tiling. And we've got these cases of, okay, case A, and here I go through all the different options, but case A, all of the choices are regular square twists. And in that case, the first one, the third one, and the fourth one are evenly spaced on the number line of squares, which is something I go into in other videos. If the first twist, or sorry, the second choice, the asymmetric position, is a hybrid twist, then this is actually functioning as a modification of an alternating pattern, which is really weird. But anyways, then case C, what comes out of the geometry is that you can completely ignore whatever the second choice is, as long as it's a regular square, as long as it's not a hybrid twist, and then just consider the other three twists for your symmetry requirements. So that's fun. And then case D, starting around the center here, is looking like case B, but that third choice here is a hybrid twist instead of a regular square. And that actually is the crease pattern that I have demonstrated here. The pattern is called lily pads. Case E is reduced symmetry, where the choice of the first, second, and third twists is kind of locking us in to a lower symmetry style. And then case F is the pure alternation, which is also contained, like we saw with the square double bar Wells pattern, that's also contained in this tree structure. So unless you prune the branches to eliminate that, you are going to get some patterns with the lower symmetry structure. So these are the kinds of things that I go over every month in Tessellation Academy, where we're looking at a different topic, whether it's alternating square twists, like the first month, February 2024, or extended symmetries in the square tiling, or looking at patterns that fold in stripes, or patterns with pseudo tiling breaks. These are all topics that we've gone over in the last year, and all of these diagrams that I'm going over today are in the Tessellation Academy membership, and they're also in the Tessellation Academy Volume 1 ebook. So there's more details in the description below about where to find the ebook, where to join the membership. The membership has open enrollment all year, so you can join whenever, stay as long as you want, and there's 2 tutorials for each topic, and diagrams and crease patterns and a theory and design session, which this video is pretty close to the theory and design sessions. So if you like this one, you're probably going to like Tessellation Academy too. So before I get into the next tilings, I wanted to show one more thing in the square tiling, which is how these tilings relate to folding sequences. So one of the real benefits of looking at a tiling diagram is you can see when you're folding, okay, I want to do one square in the center, then my next layer is going to be these squares. I'll work around in one direction or the other and just fold those squares, and I'll end up at a place where all of my pleats leaving this chunk are leaving either parallel to each other, or basically there's going to be 4 edges with 3 pleats each, and none of the pleats from any of those edges are going to run into any of the others. And then for the next layer out, I'm going to add another layer around the center, and I'm going to end up with 5 pleats in each direction, and they're not going to touch each other. And working around and around and around, we can see all of those layers. Now there is another option. We could start with 4 twists in the center, and that would be a case where, for example, I have a cluster of 4 twists that has a position of 2-fold rotational symmetry in the center, and that's the highest symmetry that I have in the pattern, so I'm going to put that in the center. And then we can work our way out and out and out. So that's something that I pay attention to when I'm looking at the symmetry extensions, which is, are the repeats of the same tile in the same row? Are the closest repeats are in the same row or column equivalently? Or are the closest repeats in some other relationship? So here the closest repeats are diagonal, not in the same row. And so if I want to have a nice pleated border in my tessellation, I'm not going to want to align the closest repeats with the edge of the paper. I'm going to want to align alternating repeats. So that's something that you can tie back in the crease pattern. And actually, let me bring up an example of that where we can see, and I organize everything by the tiling and by the symmetry within the tiling. Let's go ahead and use, let's use hybrid rosettes. This is another pattern that I taught in Tessellation Academy. Actually, it came out this month. So in this pattern, you might see this and say, okay, there's my closest repeats. That's what I want to have aligned with the edge. But what I want to caution you about is if we look at the skeleton, we see, oh, we are crossing across these lines of the tiling, and the better thing to align is actually these 2. So in the first page here, I actually give both options where I say, okay, your rotation A over L, the fraction for starting the grid, is either 5/8 if you want the tiling aligned, or 1/5 if you want the repeats aligned. We have the choice of either. And in this particular folding of it, you can see that I did have those repeats aligned diagonally relative to the edge of the paper. So this is an example of how that looks in practice. It also, I did a bit of a modification right here at the edge where I have these closed square twists, and that's kind of hinting at the underlying alternating pattern that I mentioned a bit ago, where I would have another closed square on the back here if it wasn't for those pesky hybrid square twists. It would be an alternating closed squares on opposite sides of the paper pattern, except for those hybrid squares. So that's what's going on with hybrid rosettes. That's how we can tie it all back into the square tiling, into those branching decisions that we had. And one other thing I want to mention is that just because I set this up as choices from the central square to the S1 to the S2 to the S4 position, that doesn't mean we have to make those choices in that order. You could choose S4 and S2 first and then work your way to S1 and the central twist. It's the same math, really, but playing with different options where you may be more or less likely to run into these cursed square twists. So even in these structures, it's not rigid. There's a lot of flexibility in what you can do. So we saw in the square tiling diagram that these boundaries are very easy to place on the tile boundaries, and they make rings around the center, one twist thick. That is not always the case. So for a tiling like split, hexagons, and triangles twofold, here the skeleton actually looks remarkably rectangular for being based on a triangle grid pattern. We've got these trapezoids where we have the pairs of trapezoids, and then the short edge opposite the long edge of the trapezoid goes to another trapezoid. And then the other two short edges go to triangle twists. And here we do have a lot of potential mirror symmetry, but we don't actually have any potential rotational symmetry. So we can never rotate a tile of one color to become a tile of another color because they're opposite handednesses, because they're twist tiles. So the most symmetry we can have is these mirror symmetries, and we can selectively apply mirror symmetry on whichever of these lines that we choose. We don't have to use all of them. I think only chevron field of my designs uses all of that symmetry, that mirror symmetry. And that one, I do have a tutorial inside of Tessellation Academy. And there's also a tutorial, I think, I forget if the topic was trapezoid twists or folding in stripes, but there is a tutorial on my YouTube channel as well. And so the boundary lines for this tiling match exactly the mirror symmetry lines that were available, because those are the only lines that go all the way through the pattern. If we look at any lines in the other direction, it's zigzagging all over the place, depending on whether you think that line goes through or bounces at the mirror symmetry line. It's up to you, but it's not going all the way through. And so we can't find a place where we start with, say, a pair of trapezoids and then add a layer outside of it because we would be cutting through this next layer, this next set of trapezoids. And that's no good. We would get pleat overlaps, and we would never be able to fully resolve those pleat overlaps because there would always be something that had pleats overlapping in this arrangement if we tried to work around the center. So instead of working around the center, what I tell my students is you want to start in a stripe and then finish that stripe all the way to the bottom of your paper, finish that stripe all the way to the top of your paper, and then work on the next stripe and work all the way from one side to the other, and then the next from top to bottom or bottom to top, and then work over one stripe at a time and try and figure out, okay, do I want to have a little bit of pleated boundary at the edges, or do I just want to go all the way to the edge of the paper? So that's how these patterns are going to work. And one commonality with this structure of folding in stripes is that these patterns, even though they're on a triangle grid, are going to work better on square or rectangular paper because the symmetries don't match a hexagon. The symmetries are a better match for a rectangle, actually. And you'll see a lot of these patterns have different shrinkages top to bottom than they do from left to right. So figuring out a rectangle that maybe you want the end result to be more square, you can do that with some rectangular sheet of paper. So this was a fairly simple tiling diagram, but the important thing to recognize is that these stripes are not these connected trapezoids. Even though that's what it might look like in the pattern, the stripes are perpendicular to that. It's this trapezoid triangle alternation. And then the next stripe could be the mirror image, it could be on the opposite side of the paper, it could be something else. And being able to identify which stripy thing is the tiling stripe is super useful when you go to fold, because if you fold in the other direction, you are going to have a forest of pleat overlaps to work through, and that's not going to be fun. And then that brings me to my final tiling diagram for this video, which is the hex quad rhomb tri tiling. And the base layer I always do in red and white to show that it is a two-colorable tiling, so it does have all right-handed tiles attached to left-handed tiles and vice versa, which is the requirement for the plate between them to fold flat. But we don't have to stick to that coloring. We can use different colors that mark the distinct rhombus locations. And one of the cool things about, well, I'll get to that actually when we get to the boundaries, but this helps us see better, like, okay, we've got our hexagon, we've got two distinct rhombi, we've got our triangle. Those are all the different colors that we have. Those are all the different choices that we have. Then the skeleton is showing us, okay, we've got these hex, rhomb, 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 back to hex loops. We've got these 4 rhombi loops. We've got these triangle, rhomb, 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 back to triangle loops. And those are the 3 different loops that we're going to have in this pattern. Like, you can look everywhere else, you're only going to see those 3 types of loops between the twists. And then with our symmetry, we've got our positions of 6-fold symmetry in the hexagons, 2-fold symmetry between the rhombi and 3-fold symmetry in the triangle. So then our boundaries, I'll get rid of these colors so those boundaries are easier to see. Our first boundary around the single hexagon twist is a nice boundary. Nothing after that is. That's why they change color. So our second boundary here is cutting through these hexagons. And I had mentioned with the trapezoids that you really don't want to do that if you can avoid it. But here we really can't avoid it. So we're either going to set up these rhombi as triangles the first time that we encounter them in this first ring around the center, or we're going to fold them as whole rhombi and have a lot of pleat overlaps. Then that next ring around the center looks pretty good, except there's this one rhombus sticking over the edge that, again, we're going to set up as a triangle, but not squash it. I'm going to set it up as a 3-way intersection of folds, either a 3-way intersection of mountain folds or a triangle wrap. And then that next ring around the center will resolve that rhombus that was partially set up, add some new ones, and we get 2 pleats going into our next hexagon, but we haven't done enough in the layer to support finishing the whole hexagon. Because if we did finish the whole hexagon, I would have overlaps from both the hexagon on this side and the hexagon on that side, with each of these 2 pleats coming out of these 2 rhombus twists. So there's a lot to consider here. And excuse me, water break time. And so we can see in the tiling what is and is not part of one layer around the center. Even when the twists themselves are not matching up with one layer or another. And one of the benefits, like, you know how I was talking in the square tiling about how sometimes with some symmetry extensions, the repeats are not lined up with the tiling breaks? In hex, quad, rhomb, tri, one of the great things about the tiling is that the repeats are lined up with the tiling breaks. And we could use these pseudo tiling breaks to get a pleated border by saying, okay, let's take this outer border as an example. You can say, okay, this that was going to be a rhombus, yeah, that's a triangle now. And now I get a nice border all the way around. Excuse me. So that's how I use tilings, and particularly this idea of the pseudo tiling breaks, where we're just going to add one layer, whether or not that cuts off where the twists end. That is the kind of biggest breakthrough for this style of folding that I've had, beyond coming up with a ton of different tilings. Gonna do something about that cough. So since I had that breakthrough about pseudo tiling breaks, which actually happened during the latest live sessions of Tessellations by Tiles back in 2022, that's enabled me to fold more and more difficult patterns and more different tilings that I wouldn't have approached before. And each time I try out a new tiling, I make sure to draw a tiling diagram like this so I have a guide of what is in and what is out of that next ring around the center. So that's what I'm working with these tiling diagrams and the decision trees. And yeah, I hope that y'all will join me in Tessellation Academy or in the Tessellation Academy ebook and learn more about these diagrams so that you can both fold with a recognition of this is exactly what I need to add in this ring around the center, and be able to create new designs by saying, okay, I'm going to have this choice, then that choice, and the other choice, and those are either going to have like the symmetric relationship that determines the final choice, or I have free choices for all of them, depending on the pattern, and be able to start building up that understanding that allows you to hold more origami tessellation patterns in your head and recognize what's going on in a bunch of these other patterns. So that's my goal, that everyone can fold independently whatever pattern they like. This also really helps with translating from crease patterns through the skeleton into the tiling, saying, okay, this is connected here, and like these 4 twists are making this kind of loop, and those 6 twists are making that kind of loop. Well, these are the shapes, this is how they go together, this is the tiling, and then that means these are the layers around the center that I can fold in successive steps. So happy folding, everyone. See you next week for a folding tutorial. And I will, leave it at that. Happy folding.